Hi everyone, today we're going to look at a case study using an ancient Hellenistic astrology technique known as Annual Profection. Now I've done an article on Annual Profection and the entry is found on my blog dated 20th January 2023. Now go take a look at it if you haven't, because it will provide you the context of this technique which I'm about to share with you in this case study. Now let's begin. We take a look at the case of the late martial artist Bruce Lee. Shortly before his death on 20th July 1973, Bruce was 32 years old, and he was in his 9th house profection year. The 9th house is the house associated with higher learning, philosophy, religion, faith, spirituality, and publishing. So we know that Bruce did a lot of things in 1973. He was a workaholic. And a few significant things he did when his 9th house profection year was activated was that he opened his own martial arts school in Seattle in 1973, published his first book called The Tao of Jeet Kune Do, and a month after his death, his movie Enter the Dragon was released in the cinemas. It became his legacy. Now, in that very year, Pluto is found in his 9th house profection. Pluto can be a planet of regeneration, yet at the same time a planet of death and extreme power and corruption when negatively expressed. So for Bruce, his Pluto is retrograde, which indicates that he was not anyone ordinary. Because people with Pluto retrograde usually do not act according to the rest of the group or generation, and so they stand out, either becoming famous or infamous as a result. Pluto is in Leo. The ruler of Leo is the Sun. The Sun is found in his ascendant house in Sagittarius. The ruler of the ascendant is Jupiter, and Jupiter is in the 6th house, which is 2 degrees applied quincunx to the Sun in the 1st. This shows that Bruce had been facing challenges with his health issues way before his sudden death from acute cerebral edema. His acute cerebral edema, or swelling of the brain, was reported to be caused by his allergic reaction to a prescription painkiller which he took for his back injury. This aversion between his Sun and its house ruler may also indicate that Bruce Lee identifies himself strongly through his work. Based on his solar personality and his charismatic persona, Bruce was not the type who would want to play the subordinate role in his day-to-day activities, but one can imagine that he was a slave to his exercise regime. And Pluto, as we know it, is the planet of death, destruction, and regeneration. It also exemplifies the law of retribution, in that whatever one sows, one reaps in many folds. Pluto in his natal chart forms a square with Jupiter and Saturn, as well as Mars and Venus. Although his Mars-Pluto and Venus-Pluto square aspects indicates his strong, passionate, and sometimes aggressive personality, his Jupiter-Pluto square aspect gave him overconfidence, sometimes against his own good, and at the same time, his Saturn-Pluto square aspect indicates that he had a challenging time accepting his flaws and weaknesses. And so vulnerability became his Achilles heel, in that he probably might have continued training and exerting his physical body despite despite his growing symptoms and health issues. So we see that the planet Pluto being activated in his 9th profection year brings about extremities, and one of them was a sudden and untimely death. Next, we look at Bruce Lee's untimely death on 20th July 1973 at about 8 p.m. Sources have indicated that he went to sleep at 7:30 p.m. after taking a painkiller and died shortly after. I'm taking 8 p.m. as an estimated time of his death because the painkiller would most likely take a while to take effect in his body. We now look at the transit to the 9th profection year in the 9th house with Leo as its ruler, and Leo rules the Sun. The transiting Sun is moving through his 8th house, the house of death and inheritance, also a house associated with the planet Pluto. And the transiting Sun is in applied conjunction with his natal Pluto at that time. Another thing I noticed is that Venus is transiting over his 9th house profection. Venus rules Taurus, and Taurus is Bruce's 6th house, where Uranus forms a square with the transiting Venus. This tight Uranus-Venus square aspect indicates a sudden disruptive change to his relationship due to an abrupt and unforeseen event, and this time it was his sudden death. The activated Pluto in his ninth house profection also forms an opposition to the transiting Jupiter. This aspect could indicate a struggle with expansion and power in his career, but also brings about concerns in his health and physical body as well. Transiting Jupiter forming an opposition to natal Pluto probably indicates that Bruce's obsessive behavior towards his work and success led him to not listen to his own body, and so it was likely that he pushed himself excessively to the point where he just snapped, and he did. Interestingly, the transiting Jupiter forms a square to 4 other planets, namely the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. With Jupiter squaring natal Mars, he probably bit off more than he could chew. With Jupiter squaring natal Moon, there could possibly be an emotional overreaction to some things. One could only wonder what happened. With Jupiter squaring natal Jupiter, he probably overcommitted himself in his work, overexcess or some overestimation of his energy level. With Jupiter squaring natal Saturn, he faced new opportunities in his work and day-to-day routines. Now, Bruce was already working, on his career, and he was at his peak right at that time. But because of Saturn, I guess there were a lot of things on his plate at that time regarding his opportunity in the show business and martial arts that kind of caused some delay for him. And so the conclusion is that his ninth profection year activated planets that were not very friendly with one another. Having these tense aspects and relations, nobody really knows what the real cause of his death was. But despite the prescription drug he took before going to sleep, one can only speculate that other factors like overwork and overestimation of his energy level could have caused him to snap under immense pressure due to the soaring amount of work in the making. And ironically, Bruce was also working on his then upcoming movie entitled The Game of Death shortly before he died. And also, if you have noticed, Bruce's Neptune is transiting over his ascendant house, which most likely indicates and confirms that Bruce Lee is going to lose his life that night. In astrology, we also follow the rule of threes. So if 3 or more placements are found in the chart, it sort of confirms the outcome that is in question. In closing, I'd like to give a shout out to Chris Brennan, who wrote the book, which I highly recommend, Hellenistic Astrology. Now, this book has greatly influenced me in so many positive ways. He is not only the go-to mentor, but also a great resource if you want to take a deep dive into Hellenistic astrology. Now check out his book and also Valence's Anthology, Book 4, 5, and 6. This is Frederick signing off. Stay tuned for my next case study.